Myth is not about describing reality, that's secular language. Science is all about helping us understand reality. Religion, when it's doing its job, helps us relate to reality. But it can't do that if religion thinks of God in merely otherworldly, supernatural, unnatural ways. Myth can only do its job, religion can only do its job when it helps us relate personally, humbly. Whether we think and talk about reality in a secular way, which is what science specializes in, and that's great, but religion needs to have a born-again experience. Religion needs to be saved in order to redeem our species. And by saved, all I mean is that religion has to help us once again relate to reality as reality is, not as we wish it was. And that requires us to recognize that the ecosphere is divine. And so life's nature is ecology. And it turns out ecology is the heart of every sustainable theology. And understanding ecology is to understand first and foremost the importance of limits, sacred limits, grace limits. In every relationship, there's a limit that if you cross that limit, you possibly lose the grace of that relationship. And that's true with the living world. The fundamental role of religion in healthy, sustainable cultures is to ensure that the future is never compromised by the present. Said another way, that we are accountable to the future. In fact, the most important thing I'm going to say in this sermon is summed up in 2 sentences. Sustainable means accountable to the future. Unsustainable means unaccountable to the future. And virtually everything else is either a footnote or a distraction. But whether we go extinct in the next 50 years or the next 5 million years, it's going to be probably in that time frame. And so embracing our own mortality, embracing our species' mortality, then allows us to do the things that give us joy. So doom is the midpoint between denial and regeneration, with or without us. Good morning. Since we have a full day today, I'm going to keep this rather short. And I'd like to speak to the topic of sustainability 101. Like, what are the basics of sustainability? And it turns out that ecology, as theology, is perhaps the single most important element that we find in every culture that doesn't foul its own nest. So I want to offer first 3 distinctions that it's really impossible to understand the difference between sustainable and unsustainable cultures, or even what sustainability means if we don't understand these 3 vital distinctions. The first has to do with reality, the second has to do with how we speak about reality, and the third has to do with the communities we organize around our understandings of reality. So, with respect to reality itself, all tribal cultures, First Peoples, indigenous peoples, peoples that could live in place without destroying the place, the first 97 to 99% of human history, cultures had an understanding of reality that was alive and that they were part of, they were not separate from. There was a continuity with time, that is the past and the future, and there was a sense of what I would today call the nested, intelligent nature of reality. Nested like nesting dolls, subatomic particles within atoms, within molecules, within cells, within organisms, within planets, within galaxies. Obviously, indigenous cultures didn't know about the subatomic world, but they had the sense of participatory reality. And reality was intelligent, beyond our intelligence. That everything was alive, everything had a voice, everything was to be respected as a thou, to be honored and respected, not an it, to be exploited. So whether we think of reality in a nested, intelligent sense, that intelligence is within the living world, or the distinction, whether we think of things as human-made artifacts, like a pulpit, or a computer, or a clock. Turns out that this idea of a clockwork universe where nature, that is primary reality, is no longer related to as a greater thou, but rather it's related to as a lesser it. It's just a clock. And God becomes completely trivialized as the clockmaker outside a clockwork universe. And if you believe in the clockmaker, you're a theist. And if you disbelieve in the clockmaker, you're an atheist. And both sides tend to treat the living, pulsing presence of the ecosphere, the biosphere, the living world, as merely resources for our benefit and a place for our waste. That's suicidal. It's ecocidal. It's not sustainable. And by definition, anything that's not sustainable at some point won't be sustained. Things that are unsustainable end. And only a nested, intelligent cosmos, rather than a atomized, isolated entities in a mechanistic universe, thinking of the universe like a complex clock, that distinction is vital. And the truth is that we live in a nested, intelligent cosmos, where intelligence and creativity are pervasive throughout the whole living world. So that's the first distinction. Second distinction relates to our language, how we speak about reality. And it turns out there are secular and there are mythic ways to talk about reality. And mythic isn't an otherworldly, it's not supernatural, that's the common way it's misunderstood, but mythic simply means a personal relationship to reality. It's treating reality as a thou, not an it. Turns out all the gods and goddesses are not disembodied entities, they're personifications. In fact, the most important thing to know about relating in a healthy way with reality is personification, that is, giving human characteristics to what's more than human. Gaia was not the goddess of the earth, and Gaia was not the spirit of the earth. Gaia was a personification and is a personification of earth, which is inescapably real. It's giving human characteristics to what's more than human, to our material creator, sustainer, and end. Poseidon was not the god of the oceans or the spirit of the oceans. Poseidon was a personification of the incomprehensibly powerful and capricious seas. When you're standing at the ocean's shore, it doesn't matter whether you believe in Poseidon or not. The oceans are real. And to relate, see, this is the thing. Myth is not about describing reality, that's secular language. Science is all about helping us understand reality. Religion, when it's doing its job, helps us relate to reality. But it can't do that if religion thinks of God in merely otherworldly, supernatural, unnatural ways. Myth can only do its job, religion can only do its job when it helps us relate personally, humbly. Turns out that humility is the single most important character trait or feeling state for human beings. Because given the nested nature of reality, we're made up of smaller creative, intelligent realities, like our microbiome, for example, that we can't survive without. And we're also dependent on larger creative, intelligent realities, like the ecosphere, like the trees, like the plankton. And if we simply exploit, so we're in the middle somewhere, think nesting dolls. If we exploit all the other aspects of reality for our benefit, without being concerned first and foremost with their well-being, we cause our own extinction. We cause our own demise. This is not, ecological rocket science. This is obvious. So, whether we think and talk about reality in a secular way, which is what science specializes in, and that's great, but religion needs to have a born-again experience. Religion needs to be saved in order to redeem our species. And by saved, all I mean is that religion has to help us once again relate to reality as reality is, not as we wish it was. And that requires us to recognize that the ecosphere is divine. Every sustainable culture for which we have evidence related to the ecos, the ecology, as divine, as a greater thou. And we need to learn how the ecosphere, how the biosphere works, and then align our laws, our medicine, our politics, our economics, our education, our religion with the way life works, and we can move into a just, healthy, sustainably life-giving future. To the degree we ignore how life works and we think it's all about us, we destroy the future. So, the third distinction is the distinction between pro-future and anti-future cultures. Cultures, how they speak about reality and how they encourage living, either do so in a way that's pro-future, which is pro-nature, or anti-future, which is anti-nature. So the depressing part of this, what I call sobering inspiration around this, is that anybody who thinks, as I did for about 20 years, I thought that we could make industrial civilization sustainable. I thought that if we just got enough people to vote the right people in, or to make these changes, or that everybody could have a consciousness shift, that we could become sustainable. It's only been the last 7 years, as I've been studying this stuff almost full time. 20 to 40 hours a week, I've been studying deep sustainability, the rise and fall of civilizations. So with those three distinctions, the distinction between a nested, intelligent cosmos and an atomized, mechanistic cosmos, first distinction. The second distinction is between secular language and mythic language. And by mythic, again, I mean personifying so that we can have a healthy relationship to primary reality. I mentioned before that humility is the most important trait. Hubris is the most self-destructive trait. This idea of man, conqueror of nature, is the single most idolatrous, self-destructive thought form in human history. Anthropocentrism, human-centeredness, is what idolatry is. Life-centeredness, ecocentrism, life first, is the only thing that's sustainable. And again, why this is sobering, why this is scary and a little depressing is because we're not going to shift the market economy before it hits the wall. We're not going to transform billions of people's thinking so that they become ecocentric rather than human-centered before we hit the wall. We are going to hit the wall. In fact, let me share one of my favorite passages of what I call scripture. And what I mean by that is simply inspired writings. This is from William Ophuls, who has probably done more to bring the ecological worldview into politics and governance than anybody. He says, sustainability, as usually understood, is an oxymoron. Industrial man has used the found wealth of the New World and the stocks of fossil hydrocarbons to create an anti-ecological Titanic, making the deck chairs recyclable, painting them red or blue, feeding the boilers with biofuels, and every other effort to transform or green the Titanic will ultimately fail. In the end, the ship is doomed by the laws of thermodynamics and by implacable biological and geological limits that are already beginning to bite. We shall soon be obliged to trade in the Titanic for a schooner. In other words, a post-industrial future that, however technologically sophisticated, resembles the pre-industrial past in many important respects. So, with those distinctions, I want to speak briefly about life's time and life's nature, or to speak mythically, God's time and God's nature, but not God as a supernatural being. In fact, I've started spelling the word God, G-O-D-D-E. It's the Old English spelling, G-O-D-D-E, God. Sounds the same, God, it's a personification, it's not a person. But it's Old English, it's gender neutral. Reality is feminine, reality is masculine, reality is beyond both. And a lot of feminists and neo-pagans and Catholic nuns are using the spelling because it's gender neutral. So what I mean by God is reality with a personality, not a person outside reality. So God, but because I'm speaking to Unitarians and I realize that many Unitarians have sort of a knee-jerk, like phobic reaction to God talk, I'm just going to use the word life. But I'm meaning life as a person, okay? Personification, obviously. So life's time and life's nature. Well, it turns out life's nature is ecology, and life's time is evolution. And when you look at life's time, 14 billion years of evolution, do you know when human beings show up? Actually, do you know when the dinosaurs were here on a 100-year timeline? From May of 98 to August of 99. Homo habilis, walking upright using stone tools, on December 25th of the 99th year. We domesticated fire on December 29th, and we've only been speaking in words, symbolic language, where words point to what they can never nail down because they're symbols, on the last day. December 31st of the 99th year. You've got 99 years, 364 days. The last day of a 100-year process is when life, reality, created us. Or, to use secular language, when we emerged out of the body of life. Now, I don't know about you, but if we show up on the very last day of a 100-year process, to me it indicates at least the possibility that the whole thing wasn't meant for us. That's why human-centeredness makes no sense. Because even if we last another week, that's only 2.8 million years. No mammal our size lasts longer than a week, typically. Big mammals, an asteroid, supervolcano, something takes them out. And then other species come and go. The Earth continues to spin. The moon continues to do its thing. In other words, life is about something so much more than humans. We are one small aspect of life. And one of the things that gives me hope is that even if we see World War III and it goes nuclear, and all of our nuclear power plants melt down, by early February of the 100th year, Earth will, that's like 12 to 14 million years from now, Earth will have fully recovered. That gives me hope because we're not going to see worst case scenario. It's not going to be that. We're not that stupid. Yeah, right. Let's hope at least, right? And so life's nature is ecology. And it turns out ecology is the heart of every sustainable theology. And understanding ecology is to understand first and foremost the importance of limits, sacred limits, grace limits. In every relationship, there's a limit that if you cross that limit, you possibly lose the grace of that relationship. And that's true with the living world. See, when you understand how to interpret mythic language, you realize that the fall of Adam and Eve, that mythic story, has got nothing to do with our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother eating an apple. It's about dishonoring the grace limits of primary reality. And when we do that, we kick ourselves out of the garden, to speak mythically. That is, we kick ourselves out of living sustainably as we did for the first 97 to 99% of human history, and we put ourselves on a path that leads right where we are, otherwise known as hell. But in this world, realistic hell. And we can't save ourselves. That's the interesting thing. The only thing that can save us, I'm going to use mythic language here, so watch out, especially you humanists, atheists, and free thinkers. Fasten your seatbelt. The only thing that can save us, that is to redeem our species, even if we go extinct, is by making the future our Lord. That is making the future the primary principle that guides us in the present. Every sustainable culture put the future ahead of the present, and it was religion or lifeways that ensured that. The fundamental role of religion in healthy, sustainable cultures is to ensure that the future is never compromised by the present. Said another way, that we are accountable to the future. In fact, the most important thing I'm going to say in this sermon is summed up in two sentences. Sustainable means accountable to the future. Unsustainable means unaccountable to the future. And virtually everything else is either a footnote or a distraction. And religion has been asleep at the wheel, not just for hundreds of years, but actually for a few thousand years. But again, that's only the last 20 to 30 minutes on the cosmic century timeline. We've only been living unsustainably like from 11:20 p.m. until midnight, which is what it is now on December 31st. That's why life's time and life's nature, that is evolution and ecology, must be seen and will be seen by any cultures that survive this bottleneck, because one of the scary things is that we can't stop. We are going to hit the wall. And I preached for 12 years that wasn't the case. I was a techno-optimist. I was kind of like Elon Musk and a lot of the people here in the Seattle area, I suspect. My vision of humanity was from the caves to now to the stars. We had a Star Trek vision of the future. I now know that that was completely deluded. I didn't understand energy, I didn't understand ecology, and I didn't understand power. Not energy power, but corrupt power. The way groups of corrupt psychopaths and sociopaths always cause the downfall of the civilizations that they're a part of. John Michael Greer, one of our favorite authors, calls it the senility of the elites. We know of over 100 civilizations, unsustainable civilizations over the last 7,000 years that have become great and collapsed, We know over 100, about 120. And it turns out they tend to die, they tend to take their own life in very similar ways. I don't have time to go into that. But again, the fundamental thing is whether we relate to ecology as the heart of our theology. So let me wind this down. I'm involved right now in a series of conversations with literally the top, most respected people in the world in what I'm calling post-doom. Post-doom conversations. Tomorrow we'll probably be uploading my conversation, Barbara Cecil, who's a major author in this field, our conversation with Joanna Macy, who's a mentor for many of us in this post-doom world. See, doom is the midpoint between denial and regeneration. That's why I so appreciated your focus on regenerative agriculture. See, with or without us, people say, well, will we go extinct? That's like saying, will you die? Of course we'll go extinct. We may not go extinct for another 5 million years, but that's only a half a week on this cosmic century timeline. But whether we go extinct in the next 50 years or the next 5 million years, it's going to be probably in that time frame. And so embracing our own mortality, embracing our species' mortality, then allows us to do the things that give us joy. So doom is the midpoint between denial and regeneration, with or without us. And most people keep themselves from going through the doom door because it says over the top of the door, first of all, they think it's the end. They think if they allow themselves to feel grief or despair, they're going to stay that way the rest of their lives. Turns out, no, our hearts and minds won't let us do that. So what happens is we feel grief, we feel our despair, but what that does, Joanna Macy talks about this all the time, is that reminds us of our love. You would not be experiencing grief for what we're losing if you didn't love life. It's our love and our profound interconnectedness and interrelatedness with all life that allows us to feel grief. And it turns out we don't stay in despair. Almost nobody stays in despair. But we avoid that door because it says W-A-S-F. And we interpret that as we are so. But when we allow ourselves through the doom door, we come out the other side. And there are spheres of gratitude and awe and contribution. And then we turn back and our hearts are full of joy because our lives are about service, our lives are about compassion, our lives are about generosity. Our lives are about deepening our sense of community. Our lives are about planting trees, building topsoil. And then we look back and we say, how can we feel so good in this world that seems to be collapsing around us? And then we turn back and we look, it still says W-A-S-F over that door, but we've now gone through that door. And now we experience it as we are so fortunate to be alive, to hold the grief in our hearts that reminds us of how profoundly interrelated and interconnected we are, that reminds us of our love for life. And then we're of service until we die, and we plant the seeds so that if some portion of our species survives this bottleneck, as I believe we will, I think we're going to see a major die-off over the next 100 years, quite possibly sooner than that, especially if the Arctic wigs out. But nonetheless, there's great work to do where we follow where our joy and our world's needs, or our joy and the future's needs intersect, and then we're engaged with a passion, when I speak in Christian audiences, I say, this is what the death and resurrection is about. It's not about some magical thing that happened to a God-man 2,000 years ago. It's about the nature of nature and regeneration, that is new life out of death. Compost is what it's all about. And we get to participate in that. And that's a sacred, holy responsibility. And we get to move beyond the denial. But then sometimes we go through those Kubler-Ross stages of grief. We feel anger. We feel depression. We feel bargaining. You know, if we all just get enough solar panels and enough wind power, then, you know. And I was there for many years, so I don't mean to be mocking that. I'm saying that's a normal experience. But when we realize that's not going to stop, I mean, here's the thing. We're already over the cliff. To shift to a different children's story, the Wile E. Coyote, we're already off the cliff. We just haven't looked down yet. But this does not have to be despairing. We get to play and Unitarian Universalists, what we have going for us is that we are not locked into what I call idolatry of the written word. We trust evidence as authoritative about the nature of reality. We're already several steps ahead of those who have to first get out of their idolatry of the written word for them to recognize that evidence is divinely authoritative. And ecology truly can be the heart of our theology. And in that we model grace and love and compassion and generosity for our communities.